Okay, this is the second video where I delve into pretty good detail into this book that I've been ranting about for the last 30 years, literally 29 years, literally. So the previous video was at 15 maybe. Video number 15, I went through the first and second chapters of this book. This one I'll go through the third and fourth chapters, which gets really into the meat and potatoes of the whole thing, especially that concept called public judgment. And for those of you who are a bit nervous about that phrase, public judgment, and you might think it's somewhat similar to the word populism, just wait till I get about halfway in here. I've got all these pages marked. It's in here somewhere, and I'll go through the difference. In a nutshell, the only thing they have similar about them is that they both begin with the letter P. Other than that, they're diametrically opposed to each other. So, let's start off. First of all, since this is changing maps governing in a world of rapid change, I'm going to talk about this book by Barbara Tuchman, who's probably one of the best historians of the 20th century, and she wrote this book back in the 80s called The March of Folly. We don't use that word folly too much these days, but essentially it means stupidity, idiocy. So, just by coincidence, the former Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton was on CNN just a day or two ago, and he was talking about the possibility of a full-blown war between Israelis and the Iranian proxies in the Middle East. And he mentioned this book. He talked a few times. He mentioned this phrase, the March of Folly. And that's where governments are just so stupid that they get into really bad situations. So I just want to get two sentences from the very first paragraph of this book. Mankind, it seems, makes a poorer performance of government than of almost any other human activity. Why do holders of high office so often act contrary to the way reason points and enlightened self-interest suggests? Why does intelligent mental process seem so often not to function? And really good book. It goes into detail of the Protestant Reformation and the blowback against it, as well as the American Revolutionary War, and how the English and King George III sort of messed things up there. Like they lost the continent, more or less, through stupidity. And then the Vietnam War. And so, yeah, really good book. But, okay, let's start on this. So, chapter 3 in here is, it's about something called scenario planning. And with conventional planning by governments or big organizations or what have you, oftentimes they will just look at what they think is most likely to happen. Whereas with scenario planning, they will look at different scenarios. Some of them might be pessimistic scenarios. some scenarios they figure may only be a 10% chance of happening, but they still plan taking those scenarios into account. So the people that, the brains behind these books, 14 people, and the other thing I'll do is, as I go through where the various people come into play that contributed to this book, I will flash their names and bios and CVs up on the screen, so you have a better idea. If you want, you can investigate who they are. But so this scenario planning, in this particular planning process, I mean, this book is essentially a big planning process. It was, written in 1985 or 1995, and so these 14 people from government, academia, and business, they looked at various scenarios that they thought might happen in the future, and so they came up with two different criteria. One relates to economic growth. So was there going to be economic growth, or was the economy going to stagnate or even contract? So that was one continuum, so two things there. And then the other aspect, the other criteria they were looking at was social cohesion. So is society polarized, and I think it's fair to say right now that there's quite a lot of polarization going on, even quite a bit more than there was when this book was formulated and written. We got the extreme right and the extreme left, and both of them, in my view, are kind of crazy, and I did a previous video on that. That was video number 3, and I'll put the link to the whole list of videos below. But yeah, so this, getting again with this scenario planning, so they looked at these two different criteria: economic growth versus no economic growth, and then societal cohesion versus polarization in society. And so multiply the 2 by 2, you come up with 4, and there's this graph there, not a graph, but the 4 different results they came up with. I'll just quickly go through the 4 results, and they're all based on sort of nautical scenarios. So they got the Starship scenario, where there's a booming economy and the political polarization is, there is really no political polarization. Everybody's sort of pulling together. So this is a really good scenario. That's one possible scenario they looked at in the future. This second one is the Titanic scenario, which is the complete opposite. You've got low or no economic growth, and society is split. Third one is the Bounty. I don't know if you've seen the movie Mutiny on the Bounty. Mel Gibson and Anthony Hopkins, I believe. But I think a more up-to-date analogy would be the Hunger Games, and where you have one group of citizens that are doing really well, and they're separated from another group of citizens that are really in the dumps. So you have terrible polarization in society. But for the ones that are doing really well, you have a booming economy. And the last scenario, they call it the windjammer scenario, where the economy is sort of a steady state. It's not booming, but on the other hand, you have society is pulling together. There's no extreme polarization in society. And then just to finish off that chapter, very last paragraph, it's page 75, they say, we could design a relatively desirable scenario even if we did not postulate a new economic boom. But we could not come up with a scenario in which any of us would want to live if we did not postulate success in building social cohesion. So, social cohesion was deemed even more important than whether or not the economy was booming. And then, of course, chapter 4 is titled Toward Social Cohesion. So I'll just go through some of the more relevant quotes and whatnot. Page 80, just the three of the thinkers, the people behind that came up with these scenarios. 3 of the 14, I'll just flash those on screen. And okay, so page 86. We need to develop places in which we can come together to talk about values and to talk about what we want out of our institutions. For that to work, these need to be places where people have the power to do something. I'll just repeat that last sentence. These need to be places where people have the power to do something. And that goes back to this whole thing of public judgment, right? It's where the elites in society, and the 14 people that came up with this, they were the elites in society, but they were smart enough to realize that, hey, we can't have a society like the Hunger Games, right? We have to really start pulling together, and how are we best going to do that? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about here just now. Okay, page 87 talks about conflict. Playing down conflicts can blind us to important perspectives and be self-defeating. We talk with like-minded people too much and tend to underplay the extent to which knowledge is contested. Instead, we need to bring the conflict in our perspectives to the fore and use that as a basis for learning. Further down, next paragraph, we need to set up mechanisms for dialogue and negotiation that use conflict as an essential stage in the building of that consensus. I'll just repeat that. We need to set up mechanisms for dialogue and negotiation that use conflict as an essential stage in the building of that consensus. So, page 88, still on conflict. We in Canada have pushed the parliamentary form of government in a direction that has exaggerated conflict in a very unproductive way. And you can see that in the question period where, one party will they'll blurt something out hoping it'll get them brownie points on the evening news. And then it goes further on to say here, debate occurs in secret, either in caucus or in cabinet. And here's another 3 people behind, 3 of the 14 people behind the book. I mentioned Daniel Yankelovich, who's really the he's a public opinion researcher. I don't know if he's, well, this is 1995, so I'm not even sure if he's still around. But he came up with this public judgment model. Elie Albloim, he's back in the day, he was parliamentary bureau chief for CBC TV News, and he will be talking in here about the media and where the media is not doing very well in terms of helping society along. Okay, quote on page 90. As the range of perspectives multiply in the information society, and again, I'll go back, I mentioned in the last one, they talk about information society in this book, and that was pretty much before the word internet became a thing, right? And so you'll hear that quite a bit. As the range of perspectives multiply in the information society, it requires a much greater degree of public participation in the governance process. Sounds pretty radical, but you know, much greater degree of public participation in the governance process. But our current institutions, our leaders, our political culture are not very well equipped for that task. And then it lists the 3 ways that governance works now, or back in 1995, but it's still the same. First one is representative democracy. In this model, the people do not have to be involved in formulating the decision. They just have to be ready to throw the rascals out if they don't like the results. Second way of doing governance is the PR persuasion model. And these are all traditional models of governance that were back in 95 and still operate today, still predominate today. So second one, PR persuasion model, public relations in other words, where policymakers arrive at decisions and then devote time and effort to figuring out how best to sell it to the public. Third one, public education model, where policymakers and experts realize the public isn't sufficiently aware of a threat or an opportunity and spend time and effort bringing the public up to speed. So some of that's valid, right? I mean, certainly elections, throwing the rascals out, that's certainly valid. Public education, yeah. But those are the traditional models. And it says here, oh, this is page 91, by the way, those 3 traditional models presuppose that the public has nothing positive to contribute to the formulation of policy or the framing of problems. And further on, while for the majority of issues, the more traditional models of persuasion and education are still applicable, for the most important issues, they will no longer suffice. Okay, and then it talks, page 92, talks about, it gets a little bit more in detail of where the traditional model of governance, it will work, and where you need the more, this public judgment model. And I mentioned this back in video number 4, talked about the acronym SVT. S is this, where you need to do this public judgment paradigm, is where the citizens are being asked to make a significant sacrifice, where there are conflicts of values, and where trust is lacking. So where those 3 elements are present, then the traditional model of governance just won't cut the mustard. Okay, page 93. This is where we get into a bit of differentiating public judgment from populism, or even public judgment from conventional governance, because conventional governance in some ways isn't all that different than populism. So, and they're talking about polling here, political pollsters and whatnot. People tend to insist on having an opinion on any subject, whether or not they have thought about it or whether or not they know anything about it. And you probably experience this when you get some surveyor, survey company call you up on the phone and ask you a bunch of questions. And normally I do this, because it's a good chance to get your views known, right? But on the other hand, sometimes they'll ask me a question, and I think to myself, what the hell do I know about that? So you just guess, right? You pick a number on 1 to 10, right? Totally agree, totally disagree, whatever. But in the book they talk about, and that's what they call raw opinion. So they're contrasting raw opinion with public judgment. Raw opinion is where pollsters work, conventional pollsters. And so you know that it's raw opinion if there's volatility. And it says here, page 93, if you change the wording slightly, you get a different answer. Again, that's on these survey questions, right? Another indication that it's raw opinion is if there's contradictions. When they think about preserving jobs, people will be for it. But when they think about costs to them as consumers, they will be against it. So they don't have the full information, so there are contradictions to what their thoughts are about a particular issue. And that's where I've talked about this book too before, James Fishman. This is Democracy When the People Are Thinking, and this is all about deliberative polling, which is totally different than conventional polling. I won't get into it now, but I'll flash up on the screen which previous video I did where I talked about this book and deliberative polling. Okay, now we're getting into the media and journalism. Page 94. I think the press and other institutions do a superb job of raising consciousness and of creating awareness. But what they do is get the public agitated and aroused and then move on to another issue just when people are ready to engage an issue. They move on because they see their role as creating awareness. And that's it. Kind of coincidentally, I managed to get a letter of mine about this subject of journalism, published in the July-August 2024 issue of the Literary Review of Canada. And I'll just, so here I am quoting someone else. I'm quoting Jay Rosen, who essentially invented the whole thing of public journalism. Sometimes it's called civic journalism. And so in Jay Rosen's book, and he wrote this book back in 1996, and the book is called Getting the Connections Right. And he wrote, traditional journalism assumes that democracy is what we have and information is what we need. In public journalism, information is what we have, while democracy is what we need. So it flips, right? We have Have you heard of the term democratic deficit? You know, sure, we were able to get out and vote once every 4 years or whatever, but for the rest of the time, decisions are made behind closed doors, and we have no idea what's going on, and we know the results are sometimes just like real shit shows. Okay. Page 95, this is getting back to deliberation a bit. The few institutions we do have that are intended to permit people to work through issues are designed to serve elites. So the elites are able to utilize some of this stuff, and that relates to well, again, this deliberative polling. Very rarely is it utilized by politicians to find out what we think, or a representative portion of the general citizenry. It's more a way to find out what the elites think. And this book it really goes into detail on how that process works, and really long title, Discovering Common Ground, How Future Search Conferences Bring People Together to Achieve Breakthrough Innovation, Empowerment, Shared Vision, and Collaborative Action. This again was written back in the 1990s. There's probably some similar stuff that's out now, but it's the techniques that, and I describe it in one of my other videos, so I'll flash that reference up on the screen as well. Okay, here we come again to the media, and this is where this is where you've got say a citizens assembly, which is like public judgment, or deliberative polling, and so you get a representative cross-section of the citizenry together, and talking about that. Once you reassure people that we know they are not the experts, that it isn't a case of mistaken identity, and that we really want to hear their views, there is such an outpouring that you cannot get away from it. So this is what happens with deliberative polling and or future search conferences, whatever, when the average citizenry or the representatives, or that's the wrong word, a representative slice of the citizenry is involved in making decisions. It goes on to say, the desire to be involved, to be part of the decision-making process that affects our own destiny is so powerful. It's one of the most powerful human feelings. And most often, the detachment, mistrust, aloofness, cynicism, and so on that we are seeing on the part of the public is an angry reaction to not being involved, to not being consulted with genuine sincerity. It's one of the best sentences in this book. I didn't realize I got cut off there. My camera cuts everything off at exactly 30 minutes, so it's the tail end. It's just a few more minutes, but anyways, we're still on journalism and the media here. Page 99. In their search for a clear conclusion, they militate against the kind of thoughtful, slow process that often is required. Page 100, still on the media and journalism. I think it would be the worst mistake in the world to accept the pretensions of the media to represent the public. Journalists as a group are very remote from the public. They live in their own culture and talk mostly to each other, reinforcing each other's craziness. And this is from someone who used to be the CBC representative, or the what is it now? I'll flash it on the screen. His official title: Parliamentary Bureau Chief for CBC TV. Maybe he's being a bit harsh there. I know, like I mentioned that the Literary Review of Canada, they do. I've had their a subscription for 5 years now, and they just a really good magazine. Harper's, The Atlantic. I've had a subscription for the Saturday Globe and Mail every week now for 30 years, 35 years. Yeah, 35 years now. I can't, you can't go wrong with that. But anyways, just further down the paragraph, same guy. At the same time, I've found that if you can get the idea of forming public judgment across to the media and help them to understand how they can contribute to that, they will be very responsive. So, and that goes back to a few videos ago. I talked about that Senate race between Mitt Romney and Ted Kennedy in Boston back in the early 90s, and the when the media got involved in that process and bringing the citizenry in to help I guess build that the process of the Senate race. Not sure how I can phrase it, but anyways, the resulting audience for that process, the wider audience, was larger than either the O.J. Simpson car chase or the Super Bowl. So there is real potential there for the media to get involved. Like, you'd think they'd want to get involved. Further on page 101, there is a core of shared values, but there's an overlay of cynicism, of mistrust, of disillusionment that is reinforced on almost a daily basis by the media. Fanning the flames, presenting false choices too early, or in the wrong way, or in an oversimplified way, or in an adversarial way. And this is Yankelovich, one of the other thinkers I mentioned previously, and he's talking about the process of the public judgment process, i.e. citizens' assemblies, whatever. There are at least 19 wrong ways of conducting a town meeting for every right way. Town meeting he's using as another choice for public judgment. People get much more constructive as they wrestle with the issues. They listen and they are thoughtful. They don't see it as all black or all white, so they move to a more realistic appreciation and a resolution. Okay, very last page. Very last few sentences. The public judgment model is not about elite accommodation and the brokering of agreements. It is about engaging the wider public in defining issues and options, dialoguing, deliberating, and searching for common ground. Currently, we have few institutions or practices designed to enable people to work through issues in that way. I guess just in finally summing up, this is like video number 18, and on top of that, you know, I did this crazy thing where I cycled from Edmonton to Ottawa back in the late 90s, and I even wrote a book mainly about this book, and you know, how I came to appreciate it through my university studies and whatnot. So yeah, I've been, like I said earlier on, I've been on this actually for more than 29 years, because I started doing my graduate. I never got the graduate degree, but I worked for 5 years in the graduate program, and so I gradually came to realize what was making civilization flourish versus what was making civilization stagnate or get torn apart and whatnot. And and then that's how I found this book, and that's how I became a little bit too involved. That's how why I got this thing, so I could talk to people about, you know, this issue of governance. But I'm not really making any headway. So if you've made it this far in the video, please consider spreading the word in, you know, whatever manner you can, I guess. That's about it. Thanks.